This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Joy Uweno for the first time. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We're on our third podcast for today, so we're starting to get more popular, so that's always good. We are a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. So if you use coupon code GHOST, you can receive 1 month free premium subscription. So you can stop scrolling and start listening. Newsly is a platform that you can listen to podcasts on and get alerts about your favorite news and podcasts sent to you. We will be a featured podcast on that platform later today. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, I wanted to get into what the episode's going to be about. What we kind of channeled it to be the topic is how to survive a spiritual awakening. That's what we're going to call this episode, and I actually have it up here so people will know that's what the focus on this episode is going to be. And so maybe we can kind of start with what is a spiritual awakening, and then you maybe can tell us how to survive it.
Yeah. So just to give people some context, my spiritual awakening happened a few years ago when someone I was connected to, I had a very strong connection with them. And then all of a sudden I started getting all of these, we'd always had sort of a psychic connection, like a very psychic connection. All of a sudden I started getting all of these signs that I needed to get in touch with him because we hadn't been in touch for almost a decade. And I really thought that it was about, I'm from Hawaii, so spirituality is not a new thing for me, but I had kind of separated myself from it over time. I live in Massachusetts now. And I really thought that these messages were about COVID because it was the very start of COVID and that I was going to pass and that I needed to get in touch with this person to kind of like wrap up loose ends. That was what I kept hearing everywhere I went. And what ended up happening is that very unexpectedly, we got back in touch, and a week later, he passed.
Oh, wow.
Very unexpectedly. He was only 41 years old. And I just started thinking about all the strange things, like all of these strange signs had come up, all of these things from, 18 years before in my life that he had given me were showing up on my door, like literally on my doorstep. And I thought, this is really strange. And I was very deeply in grief about this passing. And I thought, I think out of nowhere, I just thought, I think I need to talk to a medium, a spiritual medium. I'd never spoken to a spiritual medium before. And I did. And she knew all the details. Like she was, channeling him, and she could tell me all the details of our relationship that we'd never told anyone else, and all of these details around his passing. And she said to me, one of the things that had landed on my doorstep was a lavender journal that he had given me when I was 19 years old. And randomly, my parents had sent it to me from Hawaii. And she said, "Oh, he's showing me a lavender journal." No one knew about this lavender journal. And she said, he says that you should keep writing to him in it. And he's reading everything that you're writing to him. So it opened up this doorway to spirituality for me in this completely new way. And all of a sudden, like I was just getting kind of flooded with magic and people, I was getting flooded with signs and also people suddenly starting to talk to me about their views about spirituality, totally randomly, felt random, and strange things happening in my house and things like that. So spiritual awakenings are usually kicked off for people by something sudden like that. Like you're almost being broken open, right? By a grief or the ending of a relationship or something strange happening in your life. It's very sudden. And so because of that, it is, if you define trauma as something that that defines your life as a before and an after that event happening, it is a traumatic event. And so what ends up happening for people is that when they have a spiritual awakening, which is that they become aware of the fact that they are spiritual beings having a human experience and not human beings having a spiritual experience. So that differentiation and that knowledge and awakening to And remembering, because we all kind of knew that before we came here, that remembering is what is actually, like, the initial experience of the spiritual awakening.
That's very it's very interesting because, like, in my life, I had a couple of things that happened, and I'm part, I'm Cherokee and Blackfoot indigenous, Native American, and, there's that idea of, like, spirit animals, and, when I was in my 20 when I was 27, I was at home, and this hawk came into my tree and grabbed a dove and took it away right in front of me.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow. And I was 27. I'm like, that means something because, my great grandmother was a Blackfoot.
Yeah.
And I felt like spirit animals mean a lot. And I felt like there was this thing that was going to happen. And what happened is, like, a couple months later, I had sarcoma. And I went through that, and it was like a like, big moment in my life where, I survived it. I'm 55 now. I was 27 when that happened, but it was kind of like I got a precursor of that happening with the spirit animal. And I'm
Yes.
like, wow. And a lot of people don't read stuff, when things like happen, they don't pay attention. But, like, because I had that kind of, background in my genes, is like I felt like it meant something. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I think that's interesting that you're coming from that perspective because not everybody I meet has that perspective.
Yeah, I think, it's really fortunate to have come from these backgrounds where it's not, people aren't afraid of spirituality and they're not afraid of the signs and things had happened in my childhood. I growing up in Hawaii, it's like such a spiritual place. So things had happened there that I knew were spiritual in nature. But I think that really, like, when you're a spiritual person and then you're having your spiritual awakening, it is sort of mostly a deep listening to the signs because I think that we're all receiving signs all the time. But like you said, it's a matter of paying attention to them or not.
Yeah, being a musician, what I've found over the time is, some people are musicians and they sight read and they read off
Mhm.
the page and they read Beethoven, they read Bach, and other musicians are more like free form and they kind of get to a point where they trust themselves. And
Yes.
then they you feel what's around you, and I'm more of like a fusion jazz experimental musician, and, like, I like to just go into a session and put my multi-tracks on and just play, and so whatever I feel that day is my sound painting, and I
Yes.
just do it, and then I work on it later, and then sometimes I leave it exactly the way it was, or I add to it, or I move it around. But you have to feel like you feel the music because you feel it because it's like the universe is telling you something. And when you're somebody that's creative, you can channel what's inside you, what's around you, other people, other musicians around you. And it's all kind of like a nonverbal communication. We
Right.
can kind of feel it, and I've always been the kind of musician that's more nonverbal, and when I run into a musician that's a very verbal, I'm like, I'm not having as good a time
Yeah.
because they have to explain everything, and I'm like, "Well, like, you don't feel it?" Oh, it's like
Yes. Yes. I think that I was listening to I can't remember who you were speaking to, but I was listening to one of your interviews with someone and you were talking about, kind of leaving the corporate world to do creative work. And
Mhm.
I thought that that was so I think that there is something to when people are having because she had cancer
Yeah,
and
yeah.
she was teaching opera and left that job and she was so unhappy there and she was talking about the mind body connection and I think when people are spiritual in nature they have this intuitive sense that they're really connected to more strongly than other people.
Yeah, I think they have to listen to it because a lot of people, they don't listen to it because they don't wanna believe it, and they don't trust themselves, and they rather get, like, outside inputs, and there are
Yeah.
outside inputs from the world, like the spirit
Yes.
animals and stuff, but, like, if you get, like, bullied, to not be your authentic self,
Yes.
'Cause people are told, like, "Well, you can't be an artist because they don't make money."
Right,
So
exactly.
so that you go be like what's, expected, like, do that corporate job, and, I found a way to kind of do both. I found a way to do something creative. I'm a software guy, but I'm a consultant. So I don't have to deal with the structure of the corporate world, but I'm in the corporate world, but I'm kind of like in a kind of sweet spot where I don't have to deal with a lot of the bureaucracy. I just
Yeah,
like get the results. I just do what they want and then give it to them and go to the next thing. And I don't like the bureaucracy. So I'm more of a results person. This is like I just give it to me, I'll design it,
yeah,
and the same thing with music is I just feel like to feel it. And I get bored if somebody wants to get too into the weeds. It's like either you feel it or you don't.
yeah, exactly. I feel like that about life, and I think, like, one of the things when people are having a spiritual awakening is exactly what you're talking about. They get kind of mired, like, the reason why people don't allow themselves to completely awaken and kind of don't survive the spiritual awakening is because they are having a lot of judgment and input from the outside, from people being like, that's weird, or, that's not the way you do it, or that's strange. And so the reason I made my podcast, The Glimmering Pod, is because I'm trying to help people to see that this happens to other people. They're not the only ones having this experience. And, you know, spiritual awakenings can be a really lonely process because there are a lot of people saying, like, let's live life in this very specific way. And
Mhm.
having this awakening is about broadening your idea about what life can look like.
Yeah, 'cause I came up with the term with the kind of creativity I get into, and people always, as a musician, they want to pin you into a genre. And the
Yes.
way I went at it, I said, "Well, I'm into expansive sound." And I said, "What's that?" I mean, like, if I feel like doing jazz, I do jazz. If I want to do punk, I do punk. If I would do classical, I do everything.
Yeah.
And then people don't like that because they want to put you in a box. And,
Yes.
and then the same thing happened with my podcast. It's like initially I just did interviews with musicians, and then I said, well, you know what? I'm as a musician, I'm expansive, so why don't I just talk to anybody I think I want to? And then people say, well, you shouldn't do that. But we're at like episode 85. We've been doing it since 2016, so I think somehow it works. so
Yeah.
so the idea people will tell you, oh, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, and that's not the right way. You know, Hendrix didn't play like anybody else, and he's still the best today,
Yeah.
because he didn't care. He took the guitar and he was left-handed and he strung it to fit what he did, right? He played it totally different than anybody else.
Yeah.
He didn't follow like the normal standard. That's why he doesn't sound like anybody else. If more people were willing to approach things, you get the Coltrane's, you get the Miles Davis, you get all these people that are artists. But usually, what happens is that you find out that they didn't do what the trained people do. They
Yeah.
kinda train themselves. There's a lot of artists examples of people who kinda trained themselves and came out of like Einstein. He's like, when people measured him in class, he got D's. Your greatest physicist in the world, but he was getting D's when you tried to test him.
Yeah.
So that kind of tells you, like, what's the validity of the test.
Exactly, and I think that people want you to fit into a box because they can understand you better that way, but it's not really helpful to you yourself, so to have the trust in yourself to say, "This is real for me," "This thing that's happening to me is real." I think that that's, probably the biggest one of the biggest gifts of having this experience, and just saying that this is what you want your life to look like.
So the idea of a mediumship, maybe you can explain what that is in a relationship to it, because I'm not familiar with the term and what actually it entails.
Sure. So, spiritual mediumship is basically when there's a person who's trained to, um, they're sort of like a phone operator between the human world and the spirit world. And so, there are naturally gifted people who are mediums. The medium that I worked with first was named Carol Cottrell, and she's the actual like whole second. So each episode of my podcast is someone's story. And each of the episodes is connected to the other. There's 6 episodes in the first season, and the first episode is about my awakening. and what happened there. And the second episode is about Carol, and she's a medium. And she lives in South Carolina, and she had always been able to talk to and see spirits ever since she was young. And she thought everyone could see them, like they were just other people who lived in her house. And she'd
Mhm.
say to her parents, the woman who used to live here says, like, we should look in this room, or, like, this happened in this house. And her mom would say, like, how do you know that? And she'd say, oh, she told me. And so she always thought it was just kind of normal, but she stopped talking to people about it, as she got older, and people were told her that that was weird. And then when she was in her late 30s, someone told her she had been very, very depressed her whole life, and she went to see a massage therapist who said, I think you need to go see someone who does Reiki. And Reiki is energy work. And she was on the table and she thought, this is very strange. Like, this person just kind of, they kind of hover their hands over your body. And those of us who are used to Western medicine and, or massage therapy, even, we're like, what is happening? Right. But while she was there, she had a very strong emotional and psychic experience. And the Reiki master said, you're a medium. And I think you need to, she said, you're a medium, you can talk to spirits. And she was like, well, yeah, but like, that doesn't make me a medium. And she ended up going, the Reiki person said, you need to go get trained for this. And so she thought about it, and she was so depressed that she was like, you know what? Like, I'll try anything at this point, like, whatever. And so she started going to these trainings to learn how to sharpen her skills in communicating with people and spirits on the other side. And and found that she was very successful at it, and had these experiences where she could, like, sit in a she would demonstrate in front of a group of people she didn't know, blindfolded, and allow the spirits to bring her in front of the person who they wanted to deliver the message to, deliver a message about, confirming and validating their connection, and kind of giving any advice that they wanted to give to them, and then move her to another person and deliver those messages. So spiritual mediumship is really about allowing yourself to become a vessel to deliver messages from the other side.
I think that's an awesome thing to, to actually feel that and find that purpose, because a lot of people in life feel like they're not in the right position, but then
Yeah.
they don't know what to do, and they don't get shown like the way to get into, like, where they should be, because like
Yeah.
that's always been the struggle I find with a lot of people I've talked to on the podcast. Is like, a lot of people I've talked to are people who've decided to actually follow their dreams or follow who they feel their authentic self is.
Yes. I think, it was for Carol, she was so depressed, and then when she started doing the mediumship work, we call it in the spiritual community, like, getting back into alignment with your purpose,
Mm.
and she got back into alignment, and she had this really powerful experience, when she was in a workshop training where she went back to her hotel room, and she saw, like, a spirit guide show up next to her bed, and she basically, over the course of the night, watched herself purge just all of this depression that had been living in her body. And she said the next day she woke up and she felt like a completely different person. So I think there is, like, this heaviness and this density to not living your truth. And then when you're able to figure out what your path is, or allow yourself, for me, it's been an allowing. I tried to be in the corporate world for a long time, and then finally said, okay, this never works for me. this never this never is going to feel like it
Yeah.
fits. And then it was like, okay. And then I've been
Yeah, I kind of.
avoiding becoming a writer for so long, and now that I'm just doing it, it's everything feels like it's coming into place.
It's like when I found podcasting, it kind of put it. A guy came to me because I'm a musician. Like, he heard my SoundCloud. He came to this guy named Rock Tunes back in 2016. He said, "Hey, you got a lot of songs. I want to interview you. I said, "Oh, what's this? A radio interview?" "No, it's a podcast." I said, "What's that?" In 2016, I didn't know what it was. So I said, "Okay, okay, well, I guess it's like the radio. Let's do it." We started doing it, and we had such a good time on the first episode. We actually did a podcast on an app called Spearman back in 2016 for like 6 months, where we just talked about music. And then eventually he got too busy, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to go and find artists on Instagram, emerging independent artists, and just interview 'em for free because I like it." And that's what I did. And I kept on doing it, and it kept on getting bigger and bigger into a point where, what I'm doing today, it expanded.
Yes.
And it was just a way to get my voice out there. And then it actually pushed my music even more. And so, like, people say, "Well, how can you be a musician and do a podcast? You're taken away from your music." I said, "Well, it's all part of the same thing. Because if you're a musician, interacting with people gives you the content so you can write, right?"
Yes.
And so
Yes.
I look at it as every time I meet somebody, it gives me ideas, and I end up, writing better.
Yes.
Um, so I didn't look at it as something that takes away from my music. It just adds to my experience.
Yeah, I think that it's a surprise for a lot of people, that doing podcasting is so beneficial to so many other parts of your life, because I started doing it primarily in support of a book that I'm working on. And then I think what's happening is that the book is gonna support the podcast. I think that it's such an interesting medium to be able to tell a story.
What I like it also, it's free form in a world where things are like 30-second, 90-second, 1 minute, and
Yes.
you can actually communicate at a longer period of time. And what I always feel is like, like something like 5 minutes into it, you're just warming up. And if you can't, like, people, "Oh, you should only do it for 15 minutes." It's like, I really start to get to know somebody, further in. And if
Yeah.
you're gonna cut it off right when you really get to the sweet spot, that doesn't work. The same thing with, like, my music. My songs are longer than 2 minutes, and everybody's like, "Oh, you shouldn't do that." I said, "Well, that's," if you think about it, people told Freddie Mercury Bohemian Rhapsody shouldn't be as long as it is. But, he felt like, and they weren't gonna put it out. He made a film and forced it to go out because they would just say it's too long. And sometimes you have to believe in what you're doing, and like you do it because, like, I do what serves the song. If a song is supposed to be what it is, that's what it is. And
Yes.
and a lot of people try to tell you what worked before, but it's like, how do you know what's going to work if you just model it on everything that's already occurred?
Yes.
Like, you have to be willing to take the risk to move forward by doing things that are uncomfortable.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think even, with people, I think part of the reason I made my podcast was because I felt like I was wanting to tell people about what had been happening for me, and I had told people about it. Um, but I felt like I don't feel like people really understand. And so to have them all the stories strung together, I felt like, okay, and people thought it was really strange. I My background is that I've owned a family photography business and branding photography business for 6 years. And then all of a sudden I was making a podcast, and people were like, "What is
What's
what
that?
is happening?" And it was about spirituality, and they didn't understand. And then they listened to it. They listened to the first 2 episodes, and they were like, "Oh my god, this is what's been going on?" And these were people, a lot of them were people I had told things to, but piecemeal.
Yeah, they didn't get
So
the full picture.
to have like a full, nearly 6 hours of content about it, and the people who had been part of that experience, they could then see what was happening. And then a lot of, like, people I didn't know. I expected I expected like 10 people to listen to my podcast, and then it was like thousands of people who had listened to this podcast and were reaching out to me to say that that they had had experiences like these, or that they had had experiences with magic and then totally forgotten about them, and that they were now remembering to bring this back into their lives. And I think, like, you need that time to tell those stories and to connect with people on a deeper level.
Yeah, because, like, authors are given the kind of time. If you're in a, like, in the book
In a book.
format,
Yeah.
you can stretch it Yeah, but a lot of times in the modern social media, we're given very short amount of times for reels and clips and shorts. You don't have a lot of time to connect, and especially as a musician. So I found the podcast form was a good way to do live, like do live song creation, talk
Cool.
about music and get people interested so they actually go into my catalog. And then I get opportunities like I get opportunities to write theme songs for people's podcast. I get
Cool.
opportunities to work with therapists. They're like, oh, I want to figure out how to do music to incorporate it in my psychotherapy. Or you get other producers that want to talk to you because they thought it was interesting the interview you had. And so even though you might not be measured on a top 10 list, you can still end up working because
Yeah.
just being out here and putting out your point of view, people will find you. And a lot of people get scared to put out what they're doing, but like once you put it out into the world, then people find you. And then they find out there's a lot of people that feel the way you feel.
Yes. And I think that we're all connected, and I think that that's just an example of how, like, you just don't know, you can't anticipate where anything is going to go in your life. You just have to sort of keep going with it and keep reading the signs.
There was this one other point I was interested in because something I talk about in my music a lot about like the idea of like soulmates. Like in songs, people are always aspiring to find their soulmate. And so when you're writing like romantic songs, you're kind of talking in that vein. But you have this concept of the difference between soulmates and twin flames, and I want to understand what that means.
Yeah. Um, so a couple of days after so I'm married, and this was a big, the biggest question that I get about my podcast, because all of this kicked off for me because of a former partner. Everyone in my life was like, what does your husband think about all of this, right? Because I'm in communication with this partner who's on the other side, and I have the actually kind of the whole season of my podcast is leading up to the final episode being about me interviewing my husband about that question.
Hmm.
Um, but a couple of days after Jack, who is the one who passed, I just got these words in my head. And I wasn't part of a spiritual community at the time, so it was I'd never heard of this before, but it was twin flames, twin flames, twin flames, and I looked it up. And twin flames are essentially a person who is in your life, and your karmic agreement is that they're going to help you to have a spiritual awakening. And societally, our culture is very into this idea of twin flames being romantic relationships that are like
Oh,
fraught with drama and stuff like that, because twin flame relationships are often fraught with trauma because they're mirroring your best and worst parts about yourself. And to
oh,
have
hmm,
people don't like to look in the mirror, right? People like to kind of pretend that they're perfect. And so that was I when I learned about that, I was like, "Oh, that's what that was a twin flame relationship." But over time, you know, as I've looked into like the ways our culture perceives twin flames to be, I'm like, "Ooh, that's a dangerous title." Like, because people are using it to stay in really toxic relationships when
oh,
in
like
reality,
codependent relationships, maybe that aren't possible.
codependent, even abusive
Mm,
relationships, toxic relationships where people are like, you know, going through like addiction and kind of taking it out on the other person. Whereas,
mhm,
so what in reality, what a twin flame relationship really is that there is a person in your life who you're very connected to, but also like they could awaken you and will likely awaken you in a way that's just like jarring
jarring,
to your life, right? Because that's what
yeah,
awakenings are. Whereas soulmates are the general definition of a soulmate is just someone who you've had other lifetimes with, who you have agreed to like come together with in this lifetime. So it doesn't necessarily, and usually it's someone who's part of like your soul family on the other side.
mm,
So you all kind of come from, when you think about it, it's sort of like I think of soul families as being like improv groups where you all go into a lifetime together and you're all like, I'm going to play this role this time. Do you want to be my husband in this lifetime? Or do you want to
Oh,
be my
wow.
boyfriend? So you can
Yeah.
have soulmates who are like your parents and you feel very strongly connected to them.
Or your
They're like,
brother or sister maybe too.
yeah,
Yeah.
or just someone who is going to be like your partner for a short period of time, and then
Mhm.
it's over. And my husband is definitely like one of my soulmates. Like we're very strongly connected. And when I first met him, I was like, ooh, like I feel like I've known you from my
Familiar. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And so I think that it's like a really important thing to talk about to clarify what those differences are because people are always saying to me, I want to meet my twin flame and marry them. And I'm like, I don't think you do.
Well, I think the flames kinda makes people think of passion, and everybody wants passion, and
Yeah.
I kind of addressed it in my writing. I came up with this idea for a album I did a couple years ago called Ascending into Darling Mode, and the reason I came up with the idea was people were talking about the idea of falling in love, right? So I was like, "Well, that's always negative." Like, if you're falling, why do you have to fall? It seems like you're maybe in a codependent relationship that you're gonna get hurt or you're not. It doesn't like it feels like to me that like in a kind of like the idealized point of view of a relationship would be like if you're ascending, you're both kind of rising together
Yeah.
and it's not codependent that you're not nobody's on top of the other, nobody's dominant. You're both in the same you're both pulling together. Right?
Yes.
So you're ascending into this darling mode where you're actually gonna be positive. It's not negative. So I kinda did a whole record where I kinda went in after love songs where it wasn't like the country love song where, oh, I'm pining after the person or I'm the soul love song where they done me wrong or it's actually a positive kinda uplifting thing, which is not tend people don't tend to go at it that way. They tend to
Yeah.
think of it and the kind of flame type of idea that's usually kind of codependent or just is not as positive or makes you feel bad.
I think and that's what I used to get really irritated when people would ask me about, like, why what does James think about all of this? What does your husband think about all of this? And then I realized that it's because they wanted, like, drama.
Oh my
You know? And I think,
god.
like, in thinking about surviving a spiritual awakening, people are often, like, losing people during your spiritual awakening because people think it's weird or, strange, or their partners are often, like, freaked out by it, and
Yes.
that's why they're always
Yeah.
asking me that question, and what I always tell people is, if you are meant to stay with this person, your spirit family and your spirit guides are gonna bring them so much validation about what you're saying that they're not gonna be able to deny that your experiences are real because and so that you can ascend together and have this experience like at once. So for me it was like I was having this experience and my husband was like a little bit nervous that I might like become a cult member or something like that. And then he started having all of these experiences in our house with like um lights turning. He had this one experience, I'll use this example, with lights turning on and off on him in the bathroom. And he tells this story on the last episode of my podcast, but he was like he thought I was doing it to him because our light switches in New England are outside the bathroom for some reason. And I was
Oh,
like, I didn't do that. And then a couple of weeks later, I had a reading with a medium named Carissa Eve, and she said, "Oh, your grandma's here." She says that she and his grandma, my husband's grandma, are trying to get him on board with your spiritual awakening. They've been turning the lights on and off on him. And I was like, "Thank you. Thank you for that help." So, it's like then kind of that and a bunch of other little things happened, and we've been able to grow together in that experience rather than like growing apart or, you know, a lot of times it's like we call it shedding. in the spiritual community, like you're shedding people. And it's good to shed people because then you make room for new people. But I think when you
Yeah.
can have a partner and grow together, that's just the best possibility for a spiritual awakening.
Yeah, because I mean, I had traumatic things happen in my life where I had a level 3 sarcoma myself at the age of 27. And the weird thing I found is like there were people around me, other young people, they couldn't deal with me
Yeah.
because of the mortality kind of issue of everybody at that age is thinking they're like, oh, I'm gonna live forever. And I
Yeah.
had some friends that could not handle being around me because they're like, wow, you could die that young. And they're like, and they couldn't deal with me. And I kind of found like, wow, it's not something that you can catch, but it's the idea of it was
Yeah.
too much for them. And I kind of shed those people and found new people who were willing to deal with me after that point. And I
And it's
also found that after that point, I actually kind of grew as a person, was willing to kind of challenge myself because I realized my mortality. And I said, well, I've been wasting time. I need to do things that are in my head
Mhm.
and actually make them happen.
Yeah. I think it's painful to go through the shedding process, but it's such a gift because the friendships that and relationships that you bring into your life that can withstand that are so much stronger than the ones who, couldn't deal with you. They couldn't deal with the idea of
Yeah.
mortality or spirituality. My husband has a spinal cord injury, and he broke his back when he was 18. He's 50, almost 53 now, and he was he lost a bunch of people who were freaked out by, if that could happen to you, that might happen to me, and now I can't like look
Yeah.
at you anymore.
Yeah. It's always strange that how people behave.
Yeah,
Like, it's like human behavior is always interesting. It's like you don't know how people are going to react to certain things. And then you just have to live with it. You have to and kind of go where you're gonna go, because like not everybody's path is the same. Some people, like you said, are meant to be with you for a short time, and maybe you thought they were gonna be with you longer, and you never know. It's kind of like you just have to take the journey as it comes. And like in jazz music, like, you can't practice for that improvisation. You have to like live in the moment and
yeah,
kind of be kind of aware what's around you and go with it. And so just because you never heard that note doesn't mean you're gonna stop the whole performance and say, "Oh, I gotta start from the top," because or do you go with it and try to rebound? And that's why I always feel like in music, I find parallels like when you're with people and you're playing and you're able to recover or
yeah,
continue with the unexpected. It feels really good that you are able to do that. And the audience might not
yeah.
even know, that you in practice that they just kind of came together and it just happened, right there.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, you know, if you think about in meditation, you're supposed to just sort of like be like, "Oh, that's interesting. That thought showed up and that's unusual. File that away for later." And life is kind of like that if you can look at it and say, "Oh, like that person's acting weird. That's interesting." And kind of just go
Yeah,
on with
yeah,
your life and live that way. That's a much more grounded experience than kind of like fighting it and trying to hold on to people and, asking them like, why are you behaving this way? It's just, I think if we can just accept that people are having their experiences and you're having your experiences, it's a healthier place to come from.
so another concept I was interested in is like a life regression and like the past life regression, help people with their healing journey, this idea that wanted you to kind of maybe expand on.
Yeah. So um I I just recently did a past life regression session with a with a hypnotherapist, and she's going to be on my podcast. The next season of my podcast is all the people who taught me through this like journey that I've been on, and this season has been like kind of my spiritual community because spiritual awakenings can be really lonely and you shed people. And then I asked for more people to come in, and so these are the people who came in. who were actually already in my life. So next season, I'm going to be talking to a woman named Michelle Brock, and she's this amazing hypnotherapist. She's based in New York City. And my husband actually bought me the regression session as like the biggest surprise Christmas present. And it was wonderful. But she also has recordings on her website that you will walk you through the experience for yourself. But essentially, the bottom line for me is that I was trying to go like a traditional therapy route, and it was really not working for me for grief. And ended up finding, a lot of healing through working with the mediums, practicing mediumship, so taking classes, and then doing things like past life regression. And what past life regression is, for anyone who's not familiar, is you go into a deep state of hypnosis. It's not hypnosis in the way of like, you don't know what's happening around you and you don't know who you are anymore. And there's like circles spinning in your eyes. It feels like a meditation, but you see things
Mhm.
and they're sort of like almost dreamlike. But the difference is that oftentimes when you do a past life regression and you see something, you think, like, why am I having this very strong emotion attached to it? And that's what makes it really different from a like your imagination or a dream or something like that. You feel very strongly about what's happening. And so the first past life regression I had, that I did by myself, I saw that I was in a house and there was a field, and in the house there was a nursery and there was a baby girl. And I said, "What's her name?" And they told me that her name was Liliana. And then, like in the months after that, I cried, and I'm not a big crier, so I cried during that, and I thought, "What was that?" And I felt like, I don't know, did I make that up? But in the months that came afterward, it just kept coming up again and again. Like, I went to photograph random kids on campus who were wearing masks because it was during the pandemic, and I could only find one, and her name was Liliana, and like
Mhm.
we would go to places and it was Lili specifically. And there were all these places that started coming up that were Lily, Lily, Lily,
Mhm.
Lili. And when I had that session with that medium who talked about my grandma, she was like, "Your grandma's showing me a lily. Like, who's Lily?" So it's been very healing for me because in that specific instance, the question was, or the thing that was being healed is, um, that there is something that in that lifetime, that daughter had passed very young, and I had felt a lot of guilt about that. And in this lifetime, I don't have children, and I've never been interested in having children. But when I work with children, and specifically little girls during my family photo sessions, they want to be with me. Like, they're very involved and
Mhm.
connected with me. And so it was sort of just helping me to understand what that dynamic was and why I didn't want to have children in this lifetime, and what how to heal that kind of guilt that was living inside of me. And then there have
Wow.
been other things that have come up around past lives where, I've had questions about, like, why do I hold myself back? Or, why do I feel that I have to be responsible for everyone else? And those questions have been answered through regression. So it's an incredibly therapeutic and healing experience. And I think that everyone should do it if they're interested in it. I think a lot of people are afraid, and there's really
Yeah.
nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, I think people fear is like the big cause for a lot of things that I find as a creative person, a lot of people, I run into artists that like have these big backlogs of all this material that they won't show anybody. And
Yeah.
I said, well, and the thing is, I try to tell them is like there's all these stories of famous artists from like to Prince to Dylan, all these people that had all these tracks that they were scared of, and they had to have people kind of prod on them and push it. If it was up to them, they would have never put it out. So a lot of artists, you have to kind of prod and push them. They have to have other people around them that make the choices of what comes out because a lot of artists won't show their work. and they're not always the artist is not always the best representative of the what their work because they're too self-critical
Yes.
and it would never come out. And so it's like what I find is like a lot of people live their life like that with their thoughts and their dreams. They won't speak them. They won't articulate them. They won't tell their partner about them. People don't know. So there's all this stuff inside and nobody knows.
Yeah.
Well, if nobody knows, how would they? Then sometimes you act like they know. It's like, well, they don't know because they've never seen that. They never heard it. You never talked about it. So how would they know?
Yes. Yeah, I had a lot of people reach out to me after I released the podcast, and they were like, "I wanna, I wanna do something too. I wanna tell my story too. I'm just so afraid." And I just feel like, you gotta you have to share it with the world, because even if you can help just like a few people by putting out your music or putting out your story, you're helping people because we're all connected to each other, and that you just don't know what impact you can have on someone else's life.
Well, people are so scared to get judgment, and
Yeah.
that's why sometimes you can have these people follow people, and then people are leaders or people who aren't scared to actually propose something, to
Yeah.
actually stand out, and they might not even have the best idea. The best idea might be sitting in the crowd, and that person is not willing to speak it.
Right.
And it's a shame for humanity. Like so many people have probably had a lot of better ideas than some of the leaders we've had, and it's like they just weren't willing to say it, weren't willing to step up. And I think the
Yeah.
one thing today about the social media is like people have a chance to be heard and to find like people, members of this world that actually find what you're saying is interesting. And that's one of
Yeah.
the things I like about podcasting is it gets rid of the gatekeepers and allows that individual human capability, that spark to get out there and people to find that like, oh, you can actually speak your own truth. You can be confident in your individuality. You can actually say what somebody thinks is weird or somebody doesn't think is correct. Is like, well, you're gonna get people who hate what you do. As soon
Yeah.
as you make a decision as an artist, there's always a hater that said, "Well, I don't like that." I said, "Well, what do you do?" The way I look at it is like, if you're a creative person, it's like, yeah, but you get the critic. Like, are they an artist? Did they even do anything, or they just critique other people's stuff? It's like, so you have to be this confident. It's like, hey, fine, somebody's not gonna like it, but there are gonna be people that like it. So you just
Yeah. We always talk about, when I was working in marketing, we would talk about, you want to attract people or you want to repel them. And I think it's a good thing to have in life, that you're, as a human being, you're going to attract people, you're going to repel them. And that's cool. Like it's like self sorting, you
yeah,
know?
because you don't know, one market might be repelled and the other market might not. And so
Right.
it's like, because once you widen your markets to like the world, yeah, certain sectors might not dig this, they might not like that, but other places I get surprised. I get people like in Argentina or in the Middle East or Israel or in Africa is like dig something I did and I had no idea they'd like it. And I'm like
Absolutely.
because you wouldn't know if you don't put it out. Like,
Yeah.
but maybe in the Northeast of the United States, I don't get any, nobody's taking it, but
Yeah.
somewhere else on the planet, somebody dug it. So that kind of tells you, it's like, well, if you're just doing decisions based on who's immediately around you,
Mhm.
that's probably not the best decision.
I mean, I'm talking about all kinds of things that people probably think are really weird, and a lot of like normal mainstream people think are like a little there it makes them nervous, right? Because of religion or whatever. But I had a priest reach out to me and be like, "This is great." I was like
Well, you did
completely.
this spiritually, you would think you'd have like an understanding, you know.
Yeah, yeah. But a lot of religious people in my life have been like, that's dangerous, like that's black magic, blah blah blah. And then there's this priest being like, this is great, you should, I'm really glad that you're sharing your story. And I
Well,
thought,
he's like, it's kind of like the holistic mindset because there's some people they get taught something
yes.
and then they want it to be a roadmap. They want it to be like some architectural diagram, and you've got to stay inside the lines.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have just watched too many scary movies.
Yeah. Well, it's just hard to like. I guess I'm more willing because of my background to understand spirit animals, indigenous culture, and I kind of got into Buddhism. I got beyond just my what I was taught as a Christian, and then I
Yeah,
became a Buddhist, and then I also just have a holistic thinking, which means it's like I'm not gonna. I want to I want to find out what I don't know. And I
yeah,
don't wanna be controlled by somebody telling me what to think, right? I'd rather challenge and you see in science different things, they're like one day Pluto's a planet, one day it's not. One day, like, this theory is overturned by another theory, so you can't like, when I'm in software design, we always tell people, like, "You designed something in the '70s, and then we gotta replace it." And we run into the guy who designed it, and he gets offended that we're trying to redesign it. And I'm like, but you don't really own that. The company owns that, and we need to move to a new point of view. So you need to kind of play ball because it's like you're taking it too personal. Like the world in 1974 is not the world in 2023. We have to update this stuff, and your stuff doesn't work.
yeah,
So it's like if it doesn't work, we have to get beyond it. So we
yes.
have to, so some people get really offended because they take it personal. It's like
Yeah.
we can't take it personal. That's progress.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Because everything's always shifting, and then the more we learn about who we are and what we're doing here, and the more that idea expands, the more that the world has to expand to accommodate it.
Yeah,
So
it's some people just want to get stuck in the familiarity of something that's routine, even if it's not helpful.
yes.
It might not be helpful to keep on eating Twinkies.
Yeah.
When
Right.
you're a type 2 diabetic, but it's a comfort food, but it's not really helping you, is it?
Yeah, it's kinda like when you watch, like, Mad Men and you just watch that they're all smoking, right? You're like, "Wow, it's a good thing that we changed our perspectives on smoking and we're not all dying of lung cancer."
Yeah, it's just sometimes like the thing that's comfortable hurts you, right?
Right.
And you may feel like it's a comfort, but it's not actually helping you. And you gotta challenge yourself sometimes to be uncomfortable or to get your mind opened to something that you're not familiar with doesn't mean that, I think we get the fight or flight because like, oh, if I don't know that, it's scary. Or
Yeah.
that's not what my preacher told me, and that's not what my grandma told me, and that's not what I know. And then people get
Yeah.
scared of other ideas,
I've
and then
had
they like
people
yeah,
I've had people say, "Oh, well, I don't want I can't hear about, like, people being on the other side and being able to communicate with us because they're weirded out." Like, my dad is my dad is like, "Well, I just don't want them to watch me poop." I was like, I'm pretty sure they have better things to do than watch you poop,"
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's just they're
there's
very
their time doing that.
it scares people, yeah, and I think, if you think I don't wanna spend my time now doing, just peeping in on people, and so I don't think that our loved ones on the other side are trying to do that either, or trying to scare us. I think when I tell people about, the lights turning on and off or other things that have happened in our house, they're like, "Well, I don't really wanna come to your house anymore." But for
Right,
us,
like,
it's all
there's too many scary movies, like you said. It's like, people say a poltergeist or they see Friday the
right.
13th. They get into science fiction, thrillers like Hollywood. Hollywood versus like the real experience,
Hollywood
you know?
has done a very good job of making it very scary, but our our experiences of it have been all about love, and I think that I do think that there are probably scary things out there, but we've created it's all about your frequency, right? And is your frequency about love, and are you creating these boundaries around yourself to keep yourself protected?
Yeah, it's interesting about frequency because I'm a sound designer. A
Right.
lot of like as a synthesis, I have a lot of sound equipment, a lot of synthesizers I build from waveforms. So, like, when I start a song, I start with a square wave, a sine wave, a pulse wave. I start with a waveform, and then
Yeah.
I turn it and approximate it into something that equals something listenable, from like a bass to a wood block to some weird sound you never heard before. And then I use that to create music. And what I found is human beings respond to the frequencies of these waveforms when you turn them into like rhythms. Like, 'cause I can take these waveforms and turn them into wood blocks and approximate them into snare drums and kick drums and any kind of drum. And
Yeah.
once you create rhythms, the frequencies, it's still, when you track it on an oscilloscope, it's a frequency, it's a pattern. And then you see humans respond to music from like a lullaby to actually being called to action,
Right.
called to move, called to feel, called to, like, in your mind. When you hear music, you can recall paintings of certain things in your head or scenes or
Mhm.
memories that the music evokes. That sound wave is triggering that feeling.
Yeah.
So so when you discover that you're a musician, you realize that you're the person that kind of understands these waveforms. You can actually communicate like on a nonverbal way to
Yeah.
connect.
Because we're all energy. And so to connect, I think when you listen to music, it's impacting your energy in a way that, you know, a lot of people. I was just doing a Peloton ride this morning, and the instructor was like, "Oh, this song, like it just as soon as I hear it, I'm just back to that time in my life." And we've all had that experience of
Yeah.
nostalgia. And nostalgia is such a powerful experience. So I feel like there is, because we're frequency, and we're vibrating at a certain frequency, there is such power in that impact of music.
Yeah, because when you realize, like, you're exercising and you want some music to kinda hit the frequency of your activity.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you want something that's driving that makes you wanna go on a cycle bike or do the treadmill. You'll go and get something that has a pattern that makes you keyed into it, where you get kinda gun ho about it, and you're like, "Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
really into it." And why do people do that? Well, it's like kinda the same thing when you watch a big crowd at a festival and people are able to connect and get, musicians able to get that crowd to
Yeah.
almost get into the same key. It's this idea of like a universal key or universal notes that can trigger behavior.
Yeah.
And
That's
we as
fascinating.
musicians, you can see it. You can see it. You can, to the point where we can create lullabies, or we can create soothing music, ambient music. People use to go to bed, or to meditate or relax, or go to a march. Like,
Yeah.
what keys you up is like we can trigger like all kinds of things if we understand what we're doing. Um, and yeah, it just seems like, yeah, the same kind of understanding of that energy makes it possible to, to have what you're doing with the mediums. Is there's all this electricity in the world? We're keying into it. We're feeling it.
Yeah.
Feeling all this energy being, coming from the stars, coming from other living beings, coming from the planet. Like, once you realize there's so much energy in different waves happening, and we're a being, and if you start to listen or know how to look for it, you can start to realize there's stuff there. And look at my cat. My cat's looking sometimes, and their eyesight and their sense of smell from animals, they can hear and see and smell things we can't. So that doesn't mean it's not there.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
So that tells you right there.
since I started doing this work, one of my dogs is definitely aware of things that are going on. And actually our cat was staying with someone, and I didn't realize that she was very heartbroken, like about to end a relationship, until I dropped him off. And when we picked him up, the cat was in heart failure.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, "Oh, he absorbed her
Too much of it. Yeah.
frequency," and our doctor was like, "He's gonna probably pass tonight." And I was like, "What?" We just picked our
Wow.
cat up. And, I took him home, and, a bunch of my friends did Reiki on him that night, and he's still alive.
But
This was,
they can pick up like a cats are kind of known for being able to pick up a lot.
he's a
They
total empath.
They're total empathic beings, and I can see my cat, she picks up everything. Like, my wife ended up getting cancer, and my cat was picking it up.
Oh, yeah.
ahead of it.
Yeah.
And she was doing all these cues, and then we at that time, we missed them, but then we thought about it and was like, "Wow, we should have been listening to Mina," because
Yeah.
Mina was telling but the doctors were telling us something else. So
Interesting.
it's
I
like,
mean,
honestly, it wasn't, and
it's
then
amazing that
finally
you
it was, and then he picked it up, but
you had a spirit animal experience before your carcinoma, and then you had a spirit animal experience before your wife's cancer as well.
yeah, and it's just weird, the doctors couldn't find it until it got, like, to a point where it did become present, but we suspected it was there, but, modern medicine wasn't picking it up, where,
Wow.
like, the cat was, like, kinda picking it up,
Yeah.
and so that's where, like, people have to get beyond, their comfort zone in terms of, like, the spiritual, and some people have a lot of dogma, been taught a certain way from whatever practice they had, as a child, and they have a hard time, progressing. And I think
Yeah.
what's really cool about our conversation today is, people could check out your podcast and really, listen. A lot of things, people always tell you got to get listening skills. Like as a human being, you can't always be the one talking. I think sometimes you have to listen, and not just to words, but to other things.
Yeah, and the podcast itself is a storytelling podcast, so it's not just, it's not just us talking, it's really like a narrative structure, and there's actually a lot of music in it. So, that I think has been helpful in carrying people along through the story and keeping them listening.
Well, I wanted to thank you again for being on the podcast. We actually hit our hour. We always hit the hour without even thinking about it. It just happens, and it's just it's kind of just the way the reason why I like podcasting because it's a natural conversation. We have a really good time, and we always learn something. So I want people to go to the glimmeringpod.com. That will be clickable. We always ask people who watch and listen to the podcast is to support the people who we're talking to by going to their links and exploring further what we've discussed today. So I thank you for being a guest on the Family Electric Ghost podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun to talk to you.
Thank you, and have a good rest of the day. I think. Well,
Thanks.
I'm in New Hampshire, so we're not that far apart.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, so I just got a lot of editing, but I gotta promote and push all these podcasts out. So this will be fully available to your audience within a couple hours, and I'll send that to them. And there'll be a landing page for everybody to listen or watch however they want to.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks. Bye.